Now is Franklin Mansour, a former federal prosecutor, and Ronald Chapman, a federal defense attorney. Thank you both so much for joining us. You know, when something like this happens, it's a very busy news weekend, so I have a lot of questions for you. So let's get right to the logistics of what's going on with former President Donald Trump. We'll start with you, Franklin. The prospect of Trump's arrest has raised speculation about the actual process the former president would be subject to from the time of his potential arrest all the way to a potential trial. Walk us through what you think the process could look like if he is indeed indicted.
Sure. Good to see you again, Lindsay. I think the case will follow a typical path, even though the defendant is hardly a typical defendant in this case. Once the decision is made, once the indictment comes down, arrangements will be made for Trump to be arraigned in New York. I imagine he'll be released on the same day. And then at that point, the judge sets a schedule. It'll include motions. It'll include discovery where the defense gets to see the evidence that the government has. And then, of course, it'll set a trial date. Now, I imagine each of those steps will be hotly contested, and that could take a lot of time. But I think the format, the process that Trump will go through as a defendant will be pretty typical for these types of cases for a white-collar prosecution.
So, Ronald, on that note, do you think Trump's candidacy right now for president running for 2024 will impact that schedule that Franklin was just discussing?
Well, I think it might speed it up, certainly. I think we've got some very real issues here that this prosecution should be concluded before there's an election. However, historically, in cases in New York, it wouldn't move that fast, especially, as Franklin mentioned, with about every stage being hotly contested. I imagine the prosecutors would want this to move quickly, but I don't think that it will based on the motions that will be filed and the defenses that Donald Trump would raise. And I don't think we have an expectation of a plea here, a very early plea in this case, given that Donald Trump has claimed his innocence from day one.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I want to stay with you for a second, Ronald. According to reports, we have heard that security plans are being made in the case of an arrest. Given that Trump is a former president, what will those special arrangements be to avoid a public spectacle and potential violence?
Well, I've heard that there is some reports of doing a remote hearing with Trump staying down in Mar-a-Lago so that he wouldn't have to travel to New York for that spectacle. I don't know if that's allowed by the court rules, but it seems like they're looking into that. If he does have to appear, he's obviously called for protests, and there would need to be coordination of state and federal law enforcement entities in order to secure the courthouse and make sure that there's no breach. I mean, the calls that we saw for protests by Donald Trump earlier really smack of the same calls that he made during January 6th. And I think the concern there is that there would be some intimidation on the initiation of this prosecution.
Right. So let's go back to the logistics a little bit, Franklin. If Trump is indicted and charged, the case would eventually move on to jury selections. This is, of course, unprecedented. So the jury selections will probably be lengthy and exhausting and complicated. So talk about a potential timeline of that, how it would unfold. And especially, what about people who voting records? How does all of that get decided?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and your point is the right one. Who, to a certain degree, who knows, right? Because we're all guessing here. But listen, and what Ronald was just talking about with the call for protests and sort of the general statements that Trump has been making, that could result in some sort of restraining order from the judge, a gag order. On his ability to talk about the case and do these things. And that in itself could lead to intense litigation where he could challenge such a gag order on First Amendment grounds. And then that becomes a sideshow to what really is already a sideshow. But part of the purpose of the gag order, if there is one, would be to try to preserve a fair jury selection process where the jurors aren't tainted needlessly by Trump's sort of rhetoric and calls for protests and sort of challenges to the legitimacy of the prosecutors themselves. So if you put that aside, how fast we get to trial and how fast we get to these issues is really what Ronald talked about. I mean, this is going to be pushed by Trump. There's going to be motions filed. Motions usually aren't successful. The odds are in a criminal case they're not successful. These cases tend to be resolved by a trier of fact, the jury in this case. And for the reasons Ronald pointed out, there's probably not going to be a plea here. And I do agree. I think there's going to be a push these cases get delayed for legitimate reasons, right? When the prosecutor makes a decision to charge a case, the prosecutor at that point in time is miles ahead of the defense. So the defense is going to want time to get smart on the case and catch up to the prosecutors and hopefully exceed their knowledge about the facts of the case. So there are legitimate reasons to delay a trial. But I do think having that trial resolved prior to the election is going to be something that's in the judge's mind. The judge is probably going to think this case should be resolved before people go to the polls and make their decisions on who's going to be the next president.
And Ronald, I want to go back a little bit to the potential arrest that Trump himself has said is coming Tuesday, but we don't know if that's accurate. Regardless, though, he has called for supporters to protest, as you mentioned. It is invoking fears of the kind of rioting we saw at the Capitol of January 6th. Of course, in that case, there was much more notice ahead of that date. We knew January 6th was approaching. But regardless, what do we anticipate if this does happen on Tuesday? How does that affect the actual legal aspect of everything? Does it hurt Trump if he called for something like this in this particular case, or is it completely separate?
Well, it certainly does. So I want to take a step back first. And the information that Donald Trump claims to suggest that he's going to be arrested on Tuesday actually comes from news reports. His team has admitted that there's no specific information coming from the Manhattan DA indicating an arrest. So where that comes into play is my concern that Donald Trump knows this process is coming to a close and is indicating an imminent arrest just to whip up his base of supporters. Now, obviously, there's not too much notice. He's claiming the arrest would be on Tuesday, but it already seems that people have taken up the call here and are ready to protest on Tuesday in the event of an arrest. This looks to me like a bit more of a concerted effort to try to shake the Manhattan DA off of criminal charges, as opposed to his specific fear that he's going to be arrested on Tuesday.
And so, quick question for both of you before we go. Ronald, do we think Tuesday's the day? Still, even though we don't have that confirmation, do you think this week at least something's going to happen?
I have to go back to my thoughts about this case. We've got a very old case. It's not got the best statutory support. It doesn't have a very high sentence attached to it. If they're able to prove a first-degree felony here, I think the statutory maximum is 4 years, probably no jail time associated with it. I still remain a bit surprised that the Manhattan DA is interested in pursuing this case, especially in light of the pretty well-investigated federal case that may be impending against Donald Trump. So, if I had to call it, I doubt we're going to see an arrest on Tuesday. I don't know where those reports are coming from, but certainly we'll keep our eyes open and see how this case develops.
And Franklin, what do you think?
I certainly agree that I would not choose this case as the first of the criminal investigations that are occurring against Donald Trump. It's odd that we have to sort of parse out multiple criminal cases here. I also think there's a chance that this Tuesday date is much to do about nothing, but it's simply because important witnesses are still being put in the grand jury. So that indicates to me that the investigation is still ongoing. Of course, it's also often the case that when you put someone in the grand jury, you already know essentially what they're going to say. So it could be certainly that the prosecutors are wrapping their case up, but there's no indication that this is going to happen as quickly as Tuesday. But I do think it will happen eventually, and probably sometime in the short term.
And Trump has had brushes with the law since the 70s, so it is at a very long road. And so it will be interesting to see what does come out of this case. All right, Franklin Mansour, a former federal prosecutor, and Ronald Chapman, federal defense attorney. Thank you both so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time and expertise.
Thank you, Lindsay.